to our next week in the Globalization since 1945 MA module. This week we're talking about the Cold War, and so I decided to locate myself here at the Kennedy Memorial in Birmingham. I'll give you a little look around. I'm sure locals will know where I am, but if you haven't been to Birmingham before, for the distance learning students, I'm here in the neighborhood of Digbeth. So this week we're reading Reem Abdul Al-Fadl's Foreign Policy as Nation-Making, Turkey and Egypt in the Cold War. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and as I do in these introductory videos, I just want to give a little bit of a setup to the topic of the Cold War. So I'm here in Digbeth. It's a Sunday morning and it's not raining, so that's kind of a nice opportunity for me to, I think I brought my bike to get down here. So I think I'll take a spin around the neighborhood, maybe up into the city center, and say a little bit about sorry, it's cold, say a little bit about the Cold War on the way to set up this week's topic. All right, so let me get on my bike and ride. Okay, so let's leave our Cold Warrior Kennedy for the moment. Maybe I'll say a little bit more about him later. And let me just get on the road here and cruise around a bit. As I've said before, I prefer to get outside when I'm lecturing rather than just sit at my computer, which, as you've seen from lectures I've given before in this way, means it's a bit of a ramble, but maybe it's a little more interesting to have a look at what's outside. And again, I'm especially thinking of those distance learning students who may never have been to Birmingham. And if I'm still rambling when I get up there, the city center as well. So I'm going to turn here into the custard factory area. Oh, no, I think that's a one-way. Sorry, there's construction going on here, so this looks more like it. Okay, so the Cold War. So where to begin? I think the place I want to begin is by pointing out that what I want to do in this little introduction is to not describe the Cold War, but rather engage in a kind of critical interrogation of the category. And so what I mean by this is we're going to think about the Cold War we're going to think about the extent to which the Cold War is a useful category of historical analysis, to use one phrasing, and the degree to which it is not. And I feel like the book that we're reading this week is a really great example of how we might think critically about the topic that we're considering here today. Okay, let me just see, real life happens when you record content outside, so let me just get past here. Thank you. Hello. So to do that then, let's think about the Cold War as not a given category. And I think a way to think about this is to remind ourselves that actually the idea of the Cold War and the usage of the term Cold War was already a kind of partisan way of thinking about global history after World War II, kind of right from the outset. So George Orwell, Bernard Baruch, there's a few people who are sort of credited with coining the term. I'm less interested in that here. I'm more interested in pointing out that this was a term that was used in the United States to talk about kind of a waging of the Cold War. It was to describe the from the point of view of Washington, the aggressive stance of Joseph Stalin following the Second World War. So Stalin was waging a Cold War from the point of view of the United States. So it was never a neutral descriptor. And in fact, in the Soviet Union, the Cold War wasn't the kind of terminology that they used. Instead, the Soviet Union, kind of mirror imaging in some way the US stance, from Moscow, they saw the United States as the aggressive power after World War II, which they theorized as imperialism. So from the Soviet Union's perspective, Andrei Zdanov, Soviet apparatchik, we might call him, sort of sketched this out in the late 1940s as a world divided into two camps. the democratic camp, led by the Soviet Union and its allies. And here, democratic meaning not the liberal democracy of elections every 4 years, but rather the economic democracy of the party ruling in the interests of the proletariat. So this was the point of view sketched out in the Soviet Union. They were the democratic camp, and the other camp, led by the United States, was the imperialist camp. So we begin with a concept that's contested right from the outset. So in terms of historiography, which is the main thing we're going to want to think about at this MA level, I mean, there's a lot to talk about in terms of the Cold War, the events. We can describe it while also being critical of it, but there's just a massive number of kind of events that we can think about, you know, from Kennedy again comes to mind because we were just looking at the memorial there, but the two Berlin crises, Kennedy being significant to the second one, where he named himself a Berliner. The Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, détente, Reagan's sort of second Cold War. I mean, it's just sort of endless, the amount of things we can talk about. And maybe on the discussion boards, you're going to want to take up some of that stuff as well around the events of the Cold War in terms of describing it while thinking about it critically. But historiographically, where I want to come in here is to maybe do two things here by way of introduction. One, to say a little bit about the kind of phases of interpretation, particularly on the US side, which I know, as I said before, in the Soviet Union, the idea of the Cold War was never really accepted. Instead, they favored more a kind of theorization of imperialism as a continuation of imperialism in a more sort of informal format. But on the US side, historiographically, you've got three kind of main schools of excuse me, of interpretation: Orthodox, Revisionist, and Post-Revisionist, as they're called. So the Orthodox position, maybe best represented by a historian like Samuel Flagg Bemis, is one that depicts the United States as a force of liberty on the North American continent, and kind of, at least by implication, broader than that. Oh, this is nice. So they're doing some construction here. Hang on a second. So road closed, but it's filter. There's a filter there I can come through. So road closed to cars. That's just going to make this little part of the ride that much easier. Let me just say as an aside here, which again I can do in an outside lecture, which is to point out that this video that you're watching is itself a visual primary document, because it's showing us what this part of Birmingham looked like during the January 2023 phase of the construction of the HS2. That's what I'm going through here. And that's part of what this construction is about here. Okay, so the Orthodox position then it's more of a conservative position, and it views the United States again in a uncritical is maybe too strong, because you know there's range within every school of interpretation. But for the Orthodox historians, represented by Bemis and others, the United States is the more benevolent power, and in terms of the Cold War, in keeping with the description I gave earlier of the idea of the Cold War as something waged by the Soviet Union, the Orthodox position depicts the Soviets as the aggressors. And this can be in a number of forms, both in terms of the sort of aggressive, inherently aggressive ideology of communism from the perspective of the Orthodox school, and also in some ways sort of reflecting US foreign policy positions, can also be seen as based on a kind of longer term Russian, even paranoia that extends before 1917 about the relationship of the Soviet Union / the Russian Empire vis-a-vis the West. So this was the the great theme of U.S. foreign policy after World War II. So, in response to this, we have the revisionist school. And the revisionists, get out of the way of this bus here. The revisionists posited, I guess particularly we begin here with William Appleman Williams and his 1959 book, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. Williams saw the United States as the more aggressive power, particularly through his, can I talk and go up this hill at the same time? We'll see. Particularly through his analysis of the United States as an empire. Williams is, he's not the first and he's not the only thinker to position the US as an imperial force. As I said, this was already kind of a view in the Soviet Union itself. But it's an important historiographical intervention. And as you can imagine, there's considerable stakes in these interpretations in terms of whether you think the United States, particularly from the perspective of like in the 1950s, but even today, of course, very much today, if you think of the United States as primarily a force for liberty, democracy, benevolent forms of power, as opposed to someone who might see the US as an aggressive, white supremacist, economically domineering power. These aren't just sort of abstract questions, but they have very real world implications. So this is a historiographical debate then that was very charged. By the time the Society for the Historians of American Foreign Relations, Schaefer, is formed in the 1970s, historians are arguing vociferously about this stuff, shouting at each other at conferences, this kind of thing. And so the revisionists revise the kind of original position of orthodoxy. And let me say one other thing about this, because sometimes, just about the word revisionism, because sometimes revisionism, or to have a revisionist view, is sometimes depicted in public discourse as sort of ideologically motivated, or like a departure from the truth, you know, as though to say, we know this really happened, but revisionists are trying to tell some other kind of story that has more of an agenda. That's simply not true in terms of how revisionism as a concept works in historiography. You may well know this, but I think it's worth repeating. Revisionism in historiography is simply to revise an interpretation that was there before. So you might say, this isn't historiographical, but you might say the idea that the Earth is round is a revisionist position vis-a-vis a position that says that the Earth is flat. So it's another interpretation, not necessarily one that's, all interpretations have particular ideological implications and ramifications, and revisionism is no more or less so than any other. Okay, so the revisionists here then, certainly there are ideological implications in what they're saying, but of course this is also true of the Orthodox historians as well. Okay, third point of interpretation is the post-revisionist school. It's not that much of a school really, it's more of a kind of later attempt at an interpretation, most associated with the historian John Lewis Gaddis. And post-revisionism, I mean, in some ways, it was probably an attempt to, oh, you can't turn left here, I need to walk for a minute. It's the thing about being on a bicycle in a city where all the signs are for car drivers, it's not always clear if it applies to you or not, but better to be safe. So I'll just rejoin the lane up here after walking for a second. So the post-revisionist, I can imagine it as an attempt to just sort of maybe to get people to calm down, just because as I said, the debates were so sharp around this stuff. But there's a content to it as well. Gaddis was trying to sort of, at least initially, this begins in the 70s. He has an important article in the journal Diplomatic History on this, the early 1980s. And he's trying to acknowledge that both sides have sort of some legitimacy here, something to say. But what happens with post-revisionism is, over time, it kind of slides back into orthodoxy. And particularly after the Cold War itself concludes, with the availability of Eastern European and Soviet documents for historians in the West, Gaddis really takes this as a kind of confirmation, at least in my reading, of the original Orthodox position. So those are the three. So really it's kind of, I would say in a way, it's back to mostly the two positions in terms of this debate that exist are really just versions of the Orthodox and revisionist kinds of camps. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to say, was just to kind of outline those camps. The second main historiographical thing I want to say is to point to kind of a whole other, and this kind of comes back to something I was saying earlier, to a whole other sort of development in historiography around the Cold War. And again, that's this sort of notion of questioning the extent to which the Cold War, oh, you go ahead, I'll let this bus go. Go ahead. The extent to which the Cold War is kind of the best way to even see international history after World War II in the first place. So this comes out of, in my view, a kind of interaction between two historiographies, the historiography of the Cold War, and as I've already given you a sense from one field, US foreign relations, there's plenty to talk about and debate. But what many of the historians sort of writing about the Cold War, and there's many other developments too, sort of cultural turn within Cold War historiography, the very significant relationship between race and US foreign policy, as well as race within the Soviet Union. So there's a lot going on in Cold War historiography, but a whole other massive field is the history and historiography around colonialism and decolonization. And these two fields sort of come into, they interact more. There's this kind of growing realization, hey, wait a minute, this other big thing is happening at the same time. And what is the relationship between these two things? Formal decolonization, as colonized spaces became independent countries. We might say, starting with the Philippines in 1946, India, Pakistan, 47, some kind of key moments, Ghana, 1957, up until maybe Angola and Mozambique in 1975. So there's a really significant relationship between the Cold War and decolonization. And in my view, what kind of happened was, as this interaction grew more sort of robust, books with titles like Decolonization and the Cold War kind of explored these dynamics. The very idea of the Cold War sort of started to fall away, or maybe not fall away, because there's still a lot of stuff written about the Cold War from within its paradigm, but definitely came to be considered in more critical ways. So let me give you three examples of this to kind of close this out. So the three examples I can think of off the top here are historian Matthew Conley's American Historical Review article of, I think it came out in the year 2000, Taking Off the Cold War Lens, it was called. And it's about the Eisenhower administration's kind of view of the War of National Liberation in Algeria against France in the 40s and 50s. And this article gets cited all the time. It's cited in the reading that we're looking at this week as well. And I think, aside from the specific kind of content that it goes over, I think what makes this Conley's article the most significant thing about it in the end is the metaphor that it gives us, and the very fact that it gives us a metaphor. And what I mean by this is, to think about the Cold War as a lens implies that other lenses might be used. So instead of thinking of it as, again, a sort of neutral way of describing an era of international history, the metaphor of the lens introduces the possibility that there are other ways to look at it. And so from here, it now becomes, after this article, after 2000, it now becomes more the case that historians are thinking about the Cold War as a lens, and the degree to which they feel like that lens is appropriate. The second work I'm thinking about, and this is, to my mind, I mean, if someone was to ask me, what is the, I only have time to read one book about the Cold War, what should it be? A top contender would be Odd Arnie Westad's The Global Cold War. He's written 2 books with similar titles. The Cold War World History, which came out later in 2017, but his 2005, The Global Cold War, is one of the best books on the topic, bar none. And why do I say that? Because this book, well, first of all, just its scope. So it came out in 2005. I was in graduate school at the time. So, you know, there's also that kind of timing of, as a PhD student, you read particular books that influence you. This is one that influenced me. And so that's one thing, maybe for me, my own autobiographical kind of connection to the book. But more, I would say more significantly, because it affected a lot of people, its conceptualization. And so it begins with 3 chapters: the Empire of Liberty, the Empire of Justice, and the Revolutionaries. So it already situates the US and USSR as imperial forces of a sort, but it also triangulates the Cold War story by having the revolutionaries, namely the anti-colonial forces, as a third and significant factor in the era. So so this is another kind of key dimension. I think someone's impatient behind me here, but they can wait. Okay, so Westad's book is a real kind of watershed, to my mind, in terms of Cold War historiography, because it describes the conflict. It does so, as its title promises, at a global scale, but by doing that, by looking at the Cold War in a global way, not just sort of Moscow versus Washington sort of centered view, what it does is, I'm just kind of riding around in circles, by the way, at this point, but I'm almost done my introduction here. So it sort of, again, it views critically the category that it wants to look at, and it's, by implication at least, it sort of shows that the very act of looking at the Cold War in a global way puts the Cold War in conversation with formal decolonization in ways that can subsume the whole Cold War idea under maybe the more fundamental historical dynamic of colonialism and anti-colonialism. So for me, that book plays an important role in establishing that dynamic. Okay, maybe I'll take a little bit of the canal here. So the third book that I want to mention here is Masuda Hajimu's Cold War Crucible. It comes out in 2015, and it's ostensibly a kind of international study of the Korean War. But I think more fundamentally what it is, and again, this is my reading, is that it's a study of the idea of the Cold War, and it's very much a powerful argument to my mind of the ways in which the Cold War was not just sort of the natural and inevitable thing that happened after World War II, but rather it was a construct that needed to be called into being. Hey, no problem. A construct that needed to be called into being, and that people needed to consent to, and that was a kind of ideological project that took some time. And the Korean War was a really important moment, was a really important moment in establishing the idea that the Cold War, in fact, existed. Okay, so what I'm trying to get at here is there's been a kind of new historiographical development that's really quite separate than the orthodox versus revisionist kind of debates. That's more one that questions the idea. And there's a lot of other works that do this as well in recent scholarship that are questioning the Cold War idea while kind of engaging with it. Okay, so which brings us to our reading for this week. And again, as you know, I don't want to say too much about it because I'm more interested on the discussion boards to hear what you make of Reem Abdul Fadl's book on Egypt and Turkey. Let me just say this about it. There's a kind of, and this just follows directly from what I was just saying about new historiographical developments and the way that this book exemplifies, and I would very much say moves forward these ideas. Hi. Everybody okay? You all right?
Yeah, we're just stretching.
Ah, that's good to hear. Okay, great. Take it easy. Okay. So what I feel like this book does is, it very much advances this idea. It doesn't just contribute to it. And so you might want to think about, again, periodization, something we always want to think about here. In terms of, there's a way that you could think about Egypt and Turkey in the Cold War. And I'm not a historian of either of these countries, so my knowledge is pretty thin. But one way I know that Turkey and Egypt enter into the kind of sort of standard story of the Cold War is, Turkey alongside Greece in the moment of the Truman Doctrine in 1947. And so it's already a very US-centered kind of, the US is the actor. Turkey, alongside Greece, just happens to be the place where Washington is concerned about the spread of communism, and so the kind of containment idea takes hold through the Truman Doctrine to support anti-communist forces in 1947. Egypt, maybe with the officers' coup in 1952 that brings Gamal Abdel Nasser to power, but definitely with the nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956 and the war between Egypt on the one hand and Britain, France, and Israel on the other can really be told in Cold War terms, especially because the United States has enough power to more or less have it called off. Again, it can really center the Cold War sort of dynamic rather than Egyptian agency in this story. And also the way that the Suez Canal story and the war in 1956 sort of take place alongside one of the great meanwhiles of the Cold War, which is of course the Hungarian uprising and the Soviet suppression thereof, execution of Imre Nagy, and so on. So there's a way in which these sort of Turkish and Egyptian history can fit into Cold War narratives. So you might think with this week's book how the analysis we get, goes much further back and really takes seriously the 19th century, let alone the first half of the 20th. And what does that do? How does that shape our view of the Cold War to kind of pay so much attention to those dynamics and to do the work that she does of challenging this idea that Egypt and Turkey had, kind of completely opposite experiences of their engagement with European modernity and European imperialism in the 19th and certainly in the early decades of the 20th century. So what does that very sort of act of periodization do for thinking about what the Cold War means. And you know, the book is pretty forthright, and its invocation of the Cold War lens idea is, again, to diminish its explanatory power in favor of other potential paradigms. So let's think about that as well, and maybe we can take that up on the discussion board. Okay, I've rambled a lot as I've ridden around. Got to see a little bit of Birmingham along the way, and starting out at the, maybe I'll stop here, starting out at the Kennedy Memorial there. Maybe I'll finish by saying one last thing about Kennedy, and to connect him to this kind of critical interrogation of the Cold War idea is to say that that we can view Kennedy as a Cold War figure, and there's lots of reason to do that, given the kinds of events that took place in his presidency and the way that he viewed the Cold War as so significant to his own foreign policy. But we also could think about the very Kennedy Memorial that I just looked at earlier in another way, is to think about it maybe as part of a colonial story, in that memorial went up in 1968, and this is a celebration of Kennedy, and of course, you know, in the aftermath of his kind of shocking assassination in the earlier 1960s, but we can also view that as a colonial story that actually it has as much to do with the Irish community here in Birmingham, who you know, commissioned that piece of artwork. Not in that original place, by the way, I should just add. It was originally by the St. Chad's Cathedral, but in classic Birmingham style, and anticipating somewhat the next kind of theme that we'll be talking about, it was destroyed to make way for more lanes for cars in the city center. But it was rebuilt, I think it was 2013 or so, in its new location in Digbeth. But maybe there's a way of seeing that as actually a kind of claim to the space of this city from the Irish community, whose, of course, existence, presence, and many contributions to Birmingham, I think, would be difficult to understand without an analysis of colonialism. So we can see even this memorial of Kennedy, a Cold War figure, maybe through a colonial lens. Let me leave it there. Look forward to the discussion on the discussion boards, and to your responses to this book and your thoughts on the Cold War. I think we've got one more week for me in the module on mobility, so I will see you then. Bye.